Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back with another video from Totally Not Mark, continuing with this Bleach review, and we're checking out what he thinks of the Soul Society arc, which I personally feel is one of the best arcs within Bleach, and I think a lot of other people would agree with me. So let's check it out. Bleach Blind Review, the Soul Society arc.
Alrighty, Bleach time. Take 2, Electric Boogaloo, otherwise known as the Soul Society arc. I'm excited for this week because we're diving headfirst into material I haven't seen, and furthermore, I just love getting past.
Alright, so he didn't. Right, because I remember him saying he watched part of the anime, so yeah. This arc's so sick.
Things I touch on due to, in part, to those first episodes acting as a sort of jumping on point for many newcomers. Hopefully, those of you that are interested in jumping into this series have done so, because from here on out, the training wheels are coming off, and I'll be giving substantially less recap outside of areas that don't require it. In other words, it's all killer, no filler, as I attempt to understand, break down, and review possibly the most popular arc in all of
Bleach.
Bleach.
It's so sick.
I am very excited and optimistic. So, without further ado, I'm Totally Not Mark.
Part
This is my
1.
review of Bleach's Soul Society arc.
Let's do this. They gotta save Rukia.
So, first things first, damage control. So far, only 2 names have been mispronounced, which might be a new record for me. I'm proud of myself. It's Mr. Kisuke, not Mr. Kisuke, and you know what? That's my I'll hold it proudly. But I'm certain I nailed Tite Kubo when I said it. But apparently, it's Tight or Taito Kubo? That sounds strange and weirdly sexual to me, so I'm just going to call him Kubo from here on out, okay?
Mr. Kubo.
Also, last week I went into detail explaining why I preferred reading manga over watching anime, but due particularly to the length of that particular video, I never quite got around to explaining why I thought my experience with Bleach's anime and manga were so diametrically different. So, I'll quickly give that a shot here. In addition to certain characters being embellished to levels that I would argue take more from the characters than they otherwise give, I found personally the pacing and vibe of the manga so much more inviting. Oftentimes folks will complain about the pacing of roughly nowadays adapts about 75% of a given chapter per episode of anime. However, I think Bleach has the opposite problem, at least in the first arc, with a single episode potentially adapting as many as 4 or 5 chapters. And due to this roaring pace,
that is quite a pace, isn't it?
One of the coolest moments got the love and attention they deserve, and as a result, comedic or more slice-of-life-centric beats run the risk of feeling less enjoyable and potentially more obnoxious as they show up, are skipped over, or roared on past at the pace the manga didn't intend. I'll give a quick example of what I mean here. Chapter 50 is roughly when Ichigo unlocks his power against the Menos Grande. It's superbly animated, and it's one of the highlights of the first arc for sure. But that's literally only episode 14 of the anime.
Right.
Chapter 50 was adapted in episode 14.
Jeez, okay.
Whether it's a better or worse experience for a second, to create pacing like that, I think it's fair to say that the 2 approaches yield entirely different experiences. And I for one believe that's the real reason I fell in love with the manga so quickly compared to the anime. Now, let me be clear. Some shows can work really well at adapting a ton of material.
Mob Psycho! I can't wait for the new season.
Line in the sand suggesting that this is a definitive problem. Every story has different needs, and every person has their unique proclivities.
They do.
I definitely feel that for me, the anime gave Ichigo's school life the short end of the stick. And it's a shame because that was where I really fell in love with the supporting cast as well as their dynamic in the story. All of which helped to make Ichigo feel much more grounded as a result. And so, with that said, what are my expectations going into this week's material? Well, going into this arc, I have a certain amount to consider and a certain number of question marks. I don't think I mentioned this in my last video, but the setting for Bleach's story is one of the many things that set it apart from the other members of the Big Three when I compare them in my mind. Unlike One Piece and Naruto, who were both burdened with the responsibility of disclosing and explaining their world and cultures to us in interesting ways, Bleach, due to its present-day Japan-type setting, was free to focus on exploring character dynamics, power systems, as well as hint towards the world that lay beyond the first arc in the Soul Society. In other words, Bleach enjoyed a certain freedom One Piece and Naruto didn't. Where their respective settings forced them to exposit so much about how their world worked in their opening chapters, Bleach didn't due to its more traditional setting and world, and therefore could focus on what it wanted to do right off the bat through fun and short stories. However, now we reach the Soul Society, a setting that is by definition not of this earth, and so I'm keen to see how efficient, subtle, and creative Kubo can be when disclosing necessary information about the world and cultures of the Soul Society to bring it to life.
It does explain a lot, actually, in this,
We've seen these capable, subtle, and tasteful writing in the last arc, the likes of Ichigo's friends and hints towards the Soul Society not necessarily being the arbiters of all that is righteous and good in the world, so that's something I'm keeping an eye out for too. Also, this will, by the looks of things, be the first arc to assume a more solid traditional story structure rather than the episodic style Shinigami arc that we got prior. Due to these new variables, there is a good chance that this arc will feel entirely different to the one I enjoyed prior in key ways. In other words, Kubo has to juggle a number of different responsibilities as an author and artist that he otherwise didn't have to do in the prior arc. So, with all that said, let's see how this one plays out.
Let's go.
Well, this arc kicks off with a bang, and I do mean a bang. Conventionally, or at least more often, I've seen these raid-type stories from the likes of One Piece with Impel Down.
Oh, Impel Down's just absolutely epic. Like, I loved it.
Is sort of packaged as a slow build-up in the narrative. The same is true for stories like the Chimera Ants arc. Covert ops can be entertaining, but to be honest, I've always seen it as perhaps more entertaining, or at the very least, immediately interesting, when scenarios more akin to that of the Enies Lobby take place, where the bad guys know something is up right away and await you to tackle them head on. This is such the case with the Soul
I am
Society
your
arc.
obstacle now.
Immediately and right off the back of the first few pages, the Soul Society entranceway, otherwise known as Koryu, seems to be trying to kill them, alerting the guards of the trespassers and where they are. This creates immediate tension. And with us as readers knowing about as much as these guys do concerning the hostiles and strange place that they're charging into, it helps us connect to and align more with our main heroes by placing...
Yeah, it's true. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on? They don't even know either.
Chapter, I try to look out for things I might miss if I was reading this in my leisure. I notice things that, while innocuous and small scale, actually make the story all that more effective. Take, for example, this scene where they're running away from the cleaner in Soul Society. Urdu is about to be picked off, but Jad saves him.
Oh yeah, he does.
Over his shoulder, and that being totally in line with his character and philosophy that we touched on in the last video. Following that, Urdu, because he is now looking the other direction, alerts the gang to the cleaner chasing and catching up to them, allowing Orihime to make the save on everyone despite understanding the danger of doing so. All of this is cause and effect, certainly, which in and of itself can be compelling. However, every single component of what made this cause and effect sequence work was also rooted in established character traits, whether it be Chad's kindness, Uryu's vulnerability, or Orihime's selflessness and quick thinking when using her power to protect everyone at the last possible moment. All the while freeing up another natural opportunity for Mr. Cat to exposit more about the world and how dangerous that was.
Mr. Cat, interesting.
It's a very effective style of naturally disclosing exposition about the world of the Soul Society. Now, I won't be going through every decision made in the manga like this, but just know that it is there and I very much appreciate it. With that said, and in that vein, more generally, I think the fashion with which Kubo has established and set up these circumstances serves him very well. Exposition is unavoidably something every single story needs to do, and it's also one of the most difficult aspects of it to pull off. You don't want a character to suddenly start monologuing or speaking what otherwise would be subtext like, "Oh, hello, my good friend, we've been friends our entire life." That stuff sucks. Now, this arc does have characters that actually say stuff like this, and I'm not really a fan of that, but it's not so egregious and it doesn't happen too often, so I'm going to let it slide.
Right.
But at the same time, creating those scenarios for that natural-sounding exposition can be tough also. In this instance, Kubo's characters, our main four, know and understand about as much as we do concerning the Soul Society, and due to that, any action they take that might otherwise be ill-advised in this territory can be pointed out to them naturally by Mr. Cat without feeling forced or contrived to us.
True.
And speaking of ill-advised actions,
Oh,
following the frantic pace of the opening, similar to how covert missions often don't go to plan and speed up, this one benefits from being stopped in its tracks. Due to the time limit of Rukia's impending execution and the uncertainty and complexity of the journey ahead, every moment is precious and every delay could be catastrophic to their plan. And so, this giant, Jindanbo, is a great mechanism to slow down the frantic pace of this arc, establish some tension, and perhaps, most importantly, establish a sense of structure and exposition for us as an audience. In other words, on the other side of the wall is a formidable adversary, but to get to them, they need to overcome this giant gatekeeper.
I mean, it's quite symbolic as well, isn't it, him being huge.
Serves to once again communicate more about the world to us through the giant's job, how those above him reprimand him, and perhaps most importantly, how keen Ichigo is to continue his search for more experience to use against his upcoming adversaries. All of this is great, but this tussle utilizes something I
Geen just turn up and just go, nah.
is a major criticism of the series: white space in backgrounds. Something I noticed after the fallout of my last review was that folks genuinely seemed confused by my compliments towards the paneling, particularly towards Kubo's use of white space in the backgrounds. Through some of my research, I found that a popular talking point or criticism of his work is that very use of white space that I previously complimented. So I guess that makes me the perfect person to talk about it, or at the very least explain my point of view, so here it goes. In short, for me, more isn't always better. And the degree to which that is true will vary from person to person dramatically.
Okay.
People's tastes in art and manga vary as wildly as an individual's taste in music and food. So from the outset, if you guys don't like his panels because they're empty looking, I can't say that you're wrong. In the same way, you can't say that I'm wrong for disliking the taste of Coca-Cola if you happen to like it.
My
We experience
God.
in different ways and we aren't really
That's
in control of
ridiculous.
that. So why do I like it? Well, I mentioned Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball a number of times for a few reasons in the last video, and I did so because when it comes to paneling, his story is the most well-known and employs my favorite philosophy when it comes to paneling. However, it can also be observed in other more modern mangas also. Chainsaw Man is another popular manga that leverages the use of minimalistic backgrounds and white space to strengthen aspects of its series. The best way I could describe reading a chapter of Chainsaw Man would be that of a fluid experience. There are a number of occasions in that very story, and in particular the paneling, where Fujimoto depends on a reader's ability to seamlessly and in a particular rhythm read through his panels to evoke a particular emotional response. Whether it be shock or laughter, and none of that would be possible if the panels themselves were harder to read or decipher in a quick and seamless fashion. And to be clear, this isn't to say that Dragon Ball, Chainsaw Man, and Bleach don't have backgrounds. They do. In fact, Chainsaw Man has some of the most detailed backgrounds.
Yeah, it does.
When
My
they are
God.
necessary, but that's the key. There are plenty of instances where Bleach uses some detailed backgrounds, and it serves the story really well. But just because it doesn't use it all the time doesn't necessarily mean that it's flawed in any way. Placing the emphasis on characters and not the background when it doesn't matter to the story works exceptionally well for me. I like knowing at a glance where the author wants my attention to be. So make no mistake.
Yeah, so like, if you don't need a background, don't have one, because then you're focusing directly on what is needed to be seen,
What
yeah.
I value in manga, adding backgrounds when they don't contribute to the story and only really serve to distract from the seamless rhythm of the
Yeah, why have
manga's
it there?
components, its characters in this case, can only be a negative thing for me. However, to play devil's advocate, as I mentioned, the degree to which this less is more style of layouts is effective differs from reader to reader. It's no secret that millions around the world love One Piece and Oda's style when it comes to drafting layouts for a page. They love to meticulously investigate each and every panel in search of Easter eggs
there's always a lot going on.
elements. And that philosophy suits One Piece's dedicated reader base brilliantly. The story is very much designed to be something you agonize and deliberate and discuss over for hours with your friends. So the more Oda can distract people from what's actually going to happen will ultimately aid him in delivering what the fans of the series yearn for and adore. Reveals and surprises that shift the story to the next level. However, that isn't something I personally enjoy. While I was reading One Piece, for many of you already know this, to turn the page only to be greeted by dozens of panels, densely packed backgrounds, and tons of dialogue, much of which was flavor, only served to push me further away as a reader. However, when it comes to mangas like Dragon Ball, Chainsaw Man, and as I'm learning more and more, Bleach, this less is more or focused approach to paneling really
Focused approach, I like that.
The ways I look for as a reader. With that said, as I mentioned with my criticism of Chapter 1's opening, with its lack of establishing shot of who exactly was in the scene, clarity is what I value as a reader when it comes to comics. It's a visual medium, and if context that I otherwise need to enjoy a scene to its fullest potential isn't there, I will take an issue with it. Take this very scene against the giant in Chapter 73 as an example. The entire point of it is ultimately about answering one question and nothing else. And that question is, can Ichigo take these hits from this giant? From chapters prior, we understand where this is set, what the area looks like, and so, why should I care if there are backgrounds here or not? It's not serving a function in the story any longer, and for one reason or another, whether it be due to weekly deadlines or Kubo not seeing them as right for the scene, there's white space implemented. And personally, I think it's better for it. This isn't
it does look good. Does look good.
As a general rule is how I prefer things, and in the future it might shape up to be used as a crutch rather than a guiding philosophy or style. And if that does happen to be the case, I will call it out. But this is generally what I like the use of white space for. Not because I enjoy seeing nothing, but because it forces me to focus my attention exactly where the author wants me to focus. Overall, I found this introductory portion quite entertaining and effective in what it needs to do.
It's incredible.
Success. It's not without a hiccup here and there, but all things considered, I think it performed its duty very effectively. This intro consists of 3 main sequences for our hero characters. This initial bout with the giant, a regrouping at a special location to prep for going beyond the walls, and finally the preliminary cat and mouse games that eventually undergo once they get in there. Exposition and setup is the goal of this introductory portion normally, however, the trouble with setup and exposition is that by default it can be quite boring. Thankfully, there are tons of different ways to go about divulging this necessary exposition while also being entertaining. Dragon Ball tends to utilize extreme contrast to build tension and use that as a means of sneaking in exposition. Think the Namek Saga, learning the ins and outs of the Frieza Force and Frieza himself through the bouts of extreme contrast to hold our attention and interest. One Piece is also a master of pretty much every aspect of exposition.
Yeah.
In fact, I think Oda could probably write a book on that very topic.
He really could, my god.
Intriguing details being dropped out of seemingly nowhere. Hunter x Hunter actually performs this trick quite masterfully too, through Gon's backstory being filtered slowly out to us over the course of the series. It's the sort of exposition that stops being a chore to overcome and becomes something you beg and almost wait for. And that's for me the best indication of a great story. And while Bleach has made me ask questions for sure, I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I'm definitely on track to feeling this way about the series. As it happens, the tightest mangaka in all the world, Mr. Kubo, is no slouch when it comes to exposition for the most part, applying and combining all of these techniques to help him teach us about the world of the Soul Society. In the fight with the giant, Ichimaru makes himself known to us, creating a goal and contrast for Ichigo, forcing us to ask ourselves, can Ichigo really tango with this guy?
Yeah, like what's going on? How far can he actually go to save Rukia now? Because that giant was an obstacle, but these captains are...
We get offered tidbits of interesting information about what to expect inside and how to get there, with even their mastering of this new spell offering Kubo another clever means of communicating their individual character traits to us. Orihime's bubble is shielding and protective, performed perfectly. Uryu's is slightly narrow, but is getting there. Chad's is powerful and strong, but Ichigo
Bam!
And that's an important observation when thought of alongside the structure of this arc specifically, I think, and one that sets it apart from the arc before in a key way. Something that massively differentiates this arc from the last is, in my estimation, how effective different scenes have become. The catharsis that we are allowed to feel as readers has spiked considerably within the Soul Society, and I think it has everything to do with the structure of it. The classical hero's journey structure. While both this arc and the last could be seen as a single, continuous journey in many respects, with the first being evocative of elements of the hero's journey format, Soul Society thus far is practically textbook in its approach to that very structure rather than simply being evocative of it. While the first saw Ichigo accept a more general call to action by Rukia, there wasn't a definitive goal in mind, or at the very least a means outlined to get there as compelling as the Soul Society's arc provides. While entertaining and I think important to the overall story, the Substitute Shinigami arc was more focused on establishing the world and building up the main players while dropping significant breadcrumbs concerning the overarching narrative. However, with Soul Society, Ichigo quite literally needs to accept a specific call to action to save
Well,
Rukia.
definitely, yeah, we need to get there. That we've got our one objective here.
Psychological challenges to succeed on this journey, and most importantly, by the ending, he will come out an entirely different person, changed for the better, I hope. And I think due to this story once again feeling more determined to tell one long interconnected tale, the build-up along with the ebbs and flows of this tension makes for some of the most compelling scene work Bleach has had thus far, easily. And once we do eventually get inside, just like the extreme contrast between the likes of Frieza and Vegeta, or Zoro versus Mihawk earlier on in their respective series,
yes.
there are numerous extreme contrasts made to both Ichigo and the other company captains that serve to communicate all we need to set our expectations for the real meat and potatoes of the story later on. However, there is some other stuff I noticed too. Not so good stuff, but not that bad either. I pointed out plenty of instances of great exposition here in this story, but I have to be fair here too, so let's look at the other half. There's this scene with the captains that provides examples of good and unfortunately clunky exposition almost side by side, so I think it's good to use this scene to show you what I'm talking about. The topic of conversation here concerns Ichimaru's run-in with the group at the gate alongside the giant, where he effectively just lets them go, despite him seemingly having the power to not let that happen. The good exposition that takes place here comes through Ichimaru dealing with these questions from the other captains. Why did he not stop them? How he reacts to that question can be quite telling and help us to infer his motives as a character, forcing us to ask questions like, what's he planning? Does he seem to think of himself above others?
You see, right, if you know who he is and what he's
captain to say, and I quote, "Don't pretend you don't know. We of the captain class can sense the disappearance of being spirit energy." Now, I can see it already, people saying that I'm nitpicking this one instance, but firstly, it's not just this one instance.
I mean, no,
This
it's
sort of
fair.
overly descriptive dialogue happens here and there across many stories, including Bleach more than once. And secondly, if I'm going to go into the minutiae of details to praise small decisions like at the beginning of this video, I think it's reasonable that I point out shortcomings in the minutiae of detail too, because this line is such a weird thing to say to someone who should already know and understand all of this, while also being in the company of a group that already knows this
No, this
too.
as well,
And
yeah,
this
so why
stuff,
would you say that,
it
yeah.
does take me out of
Alright,
the story
yeah.
somewhat. Now, to be clear, having Ichimaru say this to elicit this sort of response isn't necessarily something I take issue with. Being so nonchalant about something like this, saying something you know will flag people intentionally, can tell us a lot about how brazen this individual truly is, what his plans might be, and where his values might lie. And while this line about being able to sense spirit energy is an important piece of exposition for us to know for sure in this arc, it's entirely unnatural in its delivery.
Yeah, like, they would not have that conversation. I see what you're saying there, yeah. Like, no one would say that.
This would be like if you walked downstairs and asked your mom, "What's for dinner today?" and your mom saying something like, "A nutritious meal, of course. As human beings, we need to absorb the energy from the plants and animals that populate this planet so as not to perish ourselves." While all of that is technically correct,
it's unnecessary and not how a conversation would go, yeah.
And instead comes across as a piece of dialogue used to communicate how humans work to aliens. It always comes off strange. However, I will concede that it is just a small gripe and it's nested within a rather intriguing plotline, one that does inject a mysterious element to the plot that genuinely adds an interesting ruffle of uncertainty to my expectations for the conclusion, compelling me to keep reading onwards as I learn more about the world of the Soul Society, its ranked members wrought with division and deceit, and of course, Rukia's ultimate fate. However, I've spoken about the fringes for long enough, so I think it's about time I analyze some of the action in this arc too.
Let's go!
The action.
The
The genre of a
action.
particular story, in a sense, and to varying degrees, can dictate how the story is most effectively told. In a murder mystery, interweaving the plot within the
Case
mysterious
closed, man. I've never watched a single episode of that.
Compelling means of interjecting with valuable details is vital in more
Oh,
slice of
your
life
name.
scenarios, and in shonen stories, as Dragon Ball does effectively and Dragon Ball Super did less effectively, fights and conflict are oftentimes the order of the day when it comes to telling some really compelling stories. And as I've discovered, Bleach is no different. Within this video's material, Ichigo takes part in 3 of the main fights that take place. First with Ikkaku, second with Renji, and eventually the third with Kenpachi, as Ichigo works his way from random ranked members to assistant captains all the way to full-blown powerhouses like Kenpachi. The purpose of
Kenpachi,
this
man,
stepping stone
oh.
type of progression through these various
The
enemies
bells
is not
and the
only
eye
to provide
patch.
Ichigo with the necessary level of competition as he gets more and more powerful to keep things interesting, but to also tell, in this case, a 3-part story for Ichigo, to show where he's beginning this journey, to show him faced with a lesson to learn, and finally, for him to be faced with a mistake he's making. The enemies he faces in these instances, while tailor-made to coax out these particular elements of each conflict, the main piece they each bring to the table is that of a stressor, to put enough pressure on Ichigo such that he's forced to look deep within himself to uncover a truth he's been neglecting. So, let's take a look at the first of these 3 fights, Ikkaku versus Ichigo. Acting as the premier contest for Ichigo to welcome him into the inner walls. Initially, what helps make this fight interesting is a particular narrative technique Kubo is leveraging called dramatic irony. Dramatic irony, for those that don't know, is just a fancy way of saying that we, as an audience, know and understand something crucial that another character in the scene or story might not be aware of. In this instance, we know that Ichigo is likely to be more than what Ikkaku is expecting. Stories like One Piece, Naruto, Hunter x Hunter, Dragon Ball, ad nauseum utilize this technique in their fights.
Yeah, you gotta have that one first fight where it's like, I got you, and it's like, I underestimated you, ah!
So, this can be more easily observed during Uryu and Orihime's fight against their larger adversary later on in the arc. The fight, however, between Ikkaku and Ichigo is very competitive. But at the end of the day, the poor Ikkaku just didn't have what it took to take down Ichigo in this instance. The winner is Ichigo. Something this fight does reinforce is that Ichigo is genuinely a kind person, refusing point blank not only to kill Ikkaku, but also helps him to heal and waits for him to wake. I think I should point out also here that when I said last week that Ichigo isn't the typical bombastic Shonen Jump good boy, I wasn't trying to suggest that he wasn't a good person.
Right, I see, yeah.
All of that. However, he has much more of an edge to him than the likes of Goku, Luffy, and Naruto do. I mean, there's a scene where Ganju meets him for the first time. Ganju grabs his face and starts getting animated, and in response to this, someone like Goku, Luffy, and Naruto might say, "Hey, get off," or "What's this guy's problem?" But Ichigo forgoes all of that and begins punching him in the face. I'm not saying Ganju didn't deserve it either, I'm just saying that I couldn't see that being the first course of action for other more prototypical shonen protagonists.
Oh, Renji!
Renji versus Ichigo.
There we go.
Following the first fight, Ichigo's training has, in his own mind, paid dividends. So far, so good. And narratively, it set a baseline for us to understand how he might measure up to the remaining 2 fights, as he graduates from a lower-ranked individual to a number 2 of a company. And while you might be thinking he's bested Renji already, as it happens, in this realm, he isn't nerfed and is in fact 5 times more powerful than he was on Earth. And Renji is viciously effective in
Hell
battle.
yes, he
And
is.
while a sizable amount of the intrigue for the fight is shared between Ichigo and Renji himself, with him fighting for a much more complicated set of reasons, as it's revealed how much Rukia has meant to him, as well as
They're like brother and sister, aren't
through
they?
various flashbacks. It's the pressure that he puts on Ichigo that forces his back into a corner, flashing us back to his training alongside Mr. Kisuke, who explained that he needed to find a resolve to follow through with what he's asking of his weapon. Not to let fear dictate how he feels, but to instead dictate to it what he is resolved to have happen. Naturally, Ichigo does grow from this experience, identifying a hole in his own game, making for another feather in his cap, he thinks, on this journey to save his friend. However, in actuality, only opened him up for a much more introspective encounter with his blade later on. The fight itself, as well as the action throughout these chapters, and indeed this arc, feel like a massive step up from the previous in both layout and artwork.
Cool.
Layouts seem to be much
Wow,
more
that's awesome.
without sacrificing clarity, all the while his armor
You see that white background? You don't need anything there. It looks awesome.
to a much more softer variant. And while I'm sure this might be a complaint for some, for me, the fact that a single chapter might cover just a decision or a particular action being executed effectively feels honestly quite refreshing. Waiting week to week might have been annoying, but to me, binging it all in one go, it feels good. Furthermore, we get more music. Renji's theme, Noro Inu, otherwise translated to Stray Dog, by Hazu featuring Il Bastino.
I'm confused. I thought he was reviewing the manga, but
Being
never
one of
mind.
the only tracks provided whose lyrics are entirely Japanese, it's very possible that Kubo derived inspiration for this character through those very lyrics, to which I would have great difficulty
whatever.
meaning. However, he probably did take inspiration from these lyrics, given that Kubo wrote descriptors like Stray Dog in the manga itself, a term used by Renji to describe himself during his flashback with Rukia as a child and coming of age, evocative of the themes of his song's namesake. The track is snappy, rhythmic, with a driving lyrical accompaniment that lends this theme an air of authority and confidence, all the while the instrumentation feels wily and disconnected from the genre itself. A lone violin amidst the synth and percussion cuts through the instrumentation. And unironically, this track feels much more like music I'd listen to in my downtime, and is something I will most certainly add to my playlist. Now, before I move on to the third best and final fight of this video, I'd like to touch on something I've been alluding to and praising throughout this first half of the arc, and that is... Aizen's killed. Much earlier in this story, one of the captains that seemed
He can't not know.
Aizen took Renji aside and started to explore
He can't not know. There's no way he doesn't know.
Something more to it. Her crimes weren't worthy of
There's no way he doesn't know. Oh.
Her rank. They changed the protocol to move her execution to a sooner date in time. All of these elements were honestly fantastic and made me lean in all the more while reading, and to be honest, outside of the fights themselves, given that the main plot seems to be rather straightforward, this nefarious and mysterious subplot of dissension amidst the ranks of the Soul Society was engrossing to say the least. Personally,
It's very, very interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
To lure in Ichigo, I mean, he is the main character, so it stands to reason. Or at least someone significant is trying to do this to Ichigo. Perhaps. Unless I'm missing out on some context here, the idea of...
I didn't see the Aizen reveal coming, like, when I first seen it. Like, I didn't see it coming at all.
Seems somewhat strange, to say the least. But I suppose it is possible, I just might not know why yet. But with that said, Captain Aizen being made an example of, holy fuck. That was a striking narrative move. But yeah, that's the situation. Now, let's return to
There's no way he doesn't know, though. Come on.
and final fight.
Let's fucking go! Kenpachi.
After being told about this
Holy
particular and dangerous
shit.
captain's proclivities for finding the strongest out of them and ignoring the others, I really enjoyed how Kubo decided to visually depict that search on the page, presenting this captain like some sort of dark reaper. Or
He
evil
really is
spectre
Kenpachi
moving around
Zaraki. He's something
until
else.
he manages to find what he's looking for.
Kenny.
Ichigo. And once he was finally revealed, he looks appropriately menacing, sporting a design as if inspired by a spider, offering a fittingly memorable silhouette to boot. This guy is totally unlike anyone
He's
we've seen
insane.
face before. He's clearly someone who's more interested in a compelling fight with a worthy adversary, and Kubo does a phenomenal job in building Kenpachi up to be the monster he needs to be for this first venture into the world of captains in the Soul Society for Ichigo. And while I do appreciate his character's hidden complexities, I genuinely think that what he offers this fight above all else is pressure for Ichigo to overcome. It is absurd how strong this guy is. Leagues above everyone.
Doesn't even have a
else we've seen
Bankai
so
at
far.
this point either.
This is a captain. And due to that tremendous pressure, Ichigo is offered the opportunity for the first time to look deep within himself for the answer as his blade manifests before him, leading to one of the coolest scenes I've yet come across in this series. This is a really interesting chapter where this manifestation of the blade asks him a single simple question, and once Ichigo answers, transports him into another plane of existence. I genuinely have no idea what this area is. It sort of reminds me of the mirror dimension from Doctor Strange, but in all honesty, judging by the dialogue shared towards the end of this encounter, I have my theories. Because here he needs to fight an alternative version of himself, and this is what I mean about Kubo utilizing the prototypical hero's journey structure to great effect.
Hello, Ichigo.
A hero must overcome a flaw in his character through great personal introspection or sacrifice. And in Bleach, to obtain the means or strength to fight Kenpachi, Ichigo has to prove to himself that he can get out of his own way, in a sense. Or at least that's what my interpretation of this is. In other words, to take control, to overcome this sinister-looking entity standing in front of him. Visually, I love the stark contrast between these two versions of Ichigo, and I love the added touch of
They look so different, but they're so similar. It's brilliant.
It doesn't show the copy's exact reflection, but instead, it shows a version of Ichigo frowning, either reflecting the real Ichigo himself presently, or this copy's true feelings. It's a really cool idea. Also, something interesting I noticed was that he kept on calling Ichigo partner. And I think that's an interesting word because it might be suggesting that this other half of his isn't something he needs to necessarily be in conflict with or fight to suppress. That in order to be an effective warrior,
God, later on.
whatever virtuous actor Ichigo wants to be, he needs to utilize the monster inside of him. This was something that could have been alluded to through his transformation, demonstrating how close he is to the hollow inside him also. And now that I think of it, the eyes and color of this other Ichigo seem to match the hollow's color scheme, made all the more apparent as Ichigo refers to this white incarnation of himself and the power of the blade he wields as monstrous. Another curious choice of words there, reinforcing again the notion that Ichigo has something to embrace from this other half through his fighting style. It's impossibly powerful and ruthlessly creative, as Ichigo says himself, in ways that he wouldn't have ever considered before. Power comes with a price, and when one typically tries to master their inner monster for the betterment of society, they of course run the risk of losing themselves to this very task. This is of course speaking philosophically. I'm willing to admit that I might be reading into something that isn't there, but with words like monster and partner being used, this sinister looking entity proving to be massively useful to Ichigo, showing him things he otherwise never would have thought of, and of course, that strange reflection in the blade, it does make me wonder. Particularly when this dangerous individual dematerializes, returning to Zangetsu, reinforcing that very notion and theory I have that this is a part of Ichigo that needs to be dealt with at some point in the future.
Oh yeah.
Kenny's theme is Super Predators by Massive Attack. This song has a presence, and I don't describe songs like that very often. If this song was a person, it'd beat you up and steal your lunch money.
Damn.
It's got this domineering and thrashing synthetic percussion and harmonic line to it, but by far the best part of this track, I think, has to be its bass line. The droning, persistent, almost sinister nature of it viscerally reminds me of Jaws, fittingly entitled Super Predator, as that perfectly exemplifies what Kenpachi is to Ichigo in this instance. Furthermore, this track gets extra points for being written and performed by Massive Attack. For those of you that might not remember this, this was the band that performed the song Teardrop, used to promote the very first Assassin's Creed game back in the day.
Wow.
Nostalgia. With all that said, the action that I've seen in this fight might be the best the manga has looked so far. From Kenpachi's looming presence at the beginning, to the introspective fight with Ichigo's inner demon, all the way to their cataclysmic clash to cap off this brilliant battle. This was an outstanding fight.
For Kenpachi just go, nah, I'm still winning this, mate.
However, before I touch on that, I'd like to address one small thing. I do fully intend on covering Chad's fight from earlier on in the arc. I'll just cover it next week if that's okay. Ichigo recovers and Rukia's rescue. The conclusion to this first half I thought was immensely satisfying. Having followed Hinataro and Ganju's heroics to get them to that point, watching Mr. Cat turn into Mrs. Cat and showing Ichigo arrive on the scene in the most dramatic fashion right in the nick of time, this might be a strange comparison, but that scene where Ichigo arrives the last possible second to protect Rukia reminds me a lot of a particular save from the Berserk franchise between Guts and Casca, acting as yet another example of a phenomenal...
That was such an epic scene, my god.
...the moment in the appropriate ambience. Now, there's a lot concerning this scene that I haven't touched on yet, and there's a specific set of instances I'd like to draw attention to more if I get the opportunity to next week with the second half of this arc. The hollow mass that continuously seems to be in the right place at the right time to save Ichigo from death, it's happened twice, and thus far seems to be in keeping with my theory that embracing a more monstrous nature isn't always a bad thing, and that on select occasions can in fact save your very life. But who knows if that interpretation is accurate or not? You guys probably do, but I have no idea. However, if you would like to see my thoughts on this arc's conclusion, tune in next week when I will finally finish and give you all my impressions on the concluding half of the Soul Society arc. Well, I
can't wait for him to see the eyes reveal. There's no way he doesn't know, but okay.
Until then, I've been Toy Not Mark. I'll see you all next time, and thank you all so much for watching.
There's no way he doesn't know, but... Cool, Soul Society arc is amazing. Yeah. So yeah, I'll check out part 2 when he releases part 2. Excuse me. Yeah, glad he's enjoying it. It is really freaking good. And yeah, I mean, I can't really say anything until I see how he feels about the whole thing. So thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, link in the description to the Patreon page. $1 helps support the channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you guys very much for that, and thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe, and leave comments down below. Let me know that I should watch future videos, and I'll see you guys next time.